Good morning, and thank you for joining us for the 20th Annual Town History Series at the Patent Free Library. My name is Mary Kate Kwasnick, and I am a Special Collections Librarian in the Sagadahoc History and Genealogy Room at PFL. The library is so happy that you could join us today for the very first talk of our series. Before I introduce you to today's speaker, I have a few important bits of information to share with you. This year's series, in its 20th iteration, is dedicated to Peter Goodwin. Peter was a longtime history room manager, Bath Historical Society trustee, and the founder of the Town History series. The series began when Bath Historical Society member Roy Lawrence offered to show slides of historic images of downtown Bath in the history room. Peter and Roy thought that maybe a few people would turn up, but from what I am told, the room was overflowing. Since then, Peter worked tirelessly to build momentum year after year to bring us to where we are today. Our community looks forward to these talks every year, and it's because of Peter's dedication and that of his successors, including Robin Haynes and Jill Peacutt-Roy, who brought us to where we are today. Thank you, Peter, for all that you have done. I also want to thank all of the historical societies and member towns for selecting our fabulous speakers this year and for helping to get the word out. And thank you to Bath Historical Society, not only for today's speaker, but for filming all of the series. If you're with us in person today, please note that the speaker is being filmed by a camera in the back of the room, so just be mindful when you're passing by. This recording will be available in our collection on DVD, and it will be available for checkout. And the Zoom recording of today's program will be on YouTube as soon as next week. If you're joining us on Zoom, please note that this is a Zoom webinar, so you cannot unmute or turn on your camera, but I will be monitoring the chat and the Q&A. If you would like to enable closed captioning, please click on the CC button at the bottom of your screen to turn them on. And please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A feature at any time during the talk. And at the end, we'll be facilitating a Q&A with our speaker. If we don't answer your questions today, you're welcome to email us at history@patent.lib.me.us, kind of a mouthful, and we can forward them on to our speaker. Our speaker today represents the Bath Historical Society. Ellen Endter was first introduced to Alice May Douglas while researching the history of her house in Bath. The pandemic provided the impetus to begin her research on Douglas, a remarkable writer and activist and journalist, famous in her time, but now largely forgotten, who lived on York Street from the end of the Civil War until World War II. Ellen won second place in adult nonfiction in last year's Patent Free Library's writing contest for her essay on Alice May Douglas entitled The Forgotten Voice. Ellen has pursued several careers, including teaching, journalism, and higher education in Maine and Massachusetts, and she is now enjoying a busy retirement in which she shares with Alice May a love of gardening and tromping through the woods, as well as hopes for peaceful existence. We are so pleased to welcome Ellen to Patent Free Library for today's talk on Alice May Douglas. Welcome, Ellen.
Thank you, Mary Kate. Frost Pictures by Alice May Douglas, from her first book of poems, Phlox, which was published in 1888 by the Times Press in Bath. Beautiful pictures every morn are sketched my window pane upon by some magic artist with careless hand. Someone escaped from fairyland, mountain and valley, hill and plain, forest and lake, and fields of grain, streams that clear as crystal flow, marble ruins and falling snow. Cities where tiny church spires rise, white-winged birds and starry skies. Elves and flowers and fallen trees, icebergs floating in polar seas. White ships tossed by ocean waves, slender seaweeds and coral caves, and countless things I cannot name are starred upon my window pane. As the rising sun's soft silvery light illumes my pictures pure and white, More beautiful to me they seem than fade away like a summer dream. To dawn again, but never the same as they were this morn on my window pane. We moved to our house at 23 York Street in 2018, and once we were settled a bit, I began researching the history of the house. As I paged back through city records, I noticed that although they had not built the house, multiple generations of just one family, the Douglases, lived in the house for almost 100 years. And I noticed that the initial generation had a daughter who listed herself in the records as poet, author, lecturer. And I thought she sounded like someone I would like to meet. I'd like to introduce you to Alice May Douglas, or reintroduce you if you already know her. She was born in Bath in 1865 and lived at 23 York Street until she died in 1943. Her parents were Quakers who had moved from a farm in West Durham to Bath about a year or two before Alice was born. And once in the city, her father, J. Lufkin Douglas, who had apprenticed as a shoemaker on the farm, became a seller of men's clothing on Front Street. And very soon, the family became members of the Beacon Street Methodist Church. My title, Alice May Douglas, A Woman of Her Century, is borrowed from one of the earliest sources I found about her life, A Woman of the Century, published in 1893, where Alice's biographical sketch is included among the likes of Louisa May Alcott, Susan B. Anthony, and Clara Barton. And Alice May was just 28 years old. The volume was edited by two women who were themselves notable women. Frances Willard, who for many years headed the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, and Mary Livermore, a journalist, abolition, and advocate for women's rights. Many of the women profiled in the book were also activists. It is clear that throughout the 19th century, abolition and women's suffrage were the great causes. And after the Civil War, there was also temperance. And I'm going to pause for a second. Mary Kate, can we get rid of the...
If you hit the X.
There it is.
Dialogue
Yeah,
box, there you
got
go.
it. Thank you. Women in the 19th century, which was the century of the book, were first emboldened by the abolition movement, where they were allowed to be active participants in groups such as the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, seen here on the left. But women abolitionists were quick to realize that if they wanted real influence, they needed the right to vote. And on the right is an 1870 lithograph of women leaders of the suffrage movement. And there at the bottom right is Mary Livermore, co-author of A Woman of the Century. Frances Willard, the chief editor of A Woman of the Century, led the Women's Christian Temperance Union for almost 20 years. By the 1890s, the WCTU boasted 150,000 dues-paying members. And if one includes the WCTU youth group, known as the Ys, membership numbered well over 200,000. As one historian has said, it was a Goliath of women's organizations. Willard certainly felt strongly about finding solutions to the poisoning effects of alcohol on individuals and families. but she saw beyond the moral imperative to the effects of alcohol use and what they did to communities. And she urged WCTU members to do everything. That was her motto. The organization became involved in advocating for women's suffrage. They tried to introduce legislation to make domestic abuse a criminal offense, which it was not then. They were cognizant of and railed against the international drug trade. And in the late 1880s, when memories of the Civil War were starting to fade, but the international news made clear that nations who wanted to become empires, that would likely lead to international conflicts, the WCTU added a Department of Peace and Arbitration. Alice May Douglas was drawn to the causes championed by the WCTU. And you can see on these slides, WCTU parades in Maine, one in Bangor in 1909 and one in Guilford in 1910. They were very well attended. Alice May Douglas was drawn to the causes championed by the WCTU, and it is her advocacy and activism for temperance and peace that continued far beyond the end of the 19th century. And I believe on that, her repute as Woman of the Century justly rests. These are some of the things that Alice managed to do before she turned 30. As I searched online sources during the pandemic, looking for traces of Alice May Douglas, I found an astonishing body of work, powerful essays, serialized novels, and public addresses. Douglas, it turned out, ardently supported temperance and pacifism on a very public forum. She saw the links between alcohol abuse and violence and worked to correct a world that was tilting toward worldwide conflict. In Alice's century, which spanned the end of the 19th century after slavery to well into the 20th century, to give you some context, Bath went from a city of horses and manual labor that would have been recognizable to those born 100 or more years earlier. Here are two views of Front Street in the mid-1800s. To a city with cars, trucks, electric wires, and a stoplight. This is the first stoplight in Bath. And that photograph was taken by her nephew, Herbert Douglas. And as well, the building of the Carleton Bridge across the mighty Kennebec. And even this. Alice wasn't alone in stretching barriers for women at the time. In 1913, there was a woman aviator, the most famous woman aviator of the time, Ruth Bancroft Law, at the Bath Carnival. And I love the clipping on the right, the headline, Bath looked small. Bath went from a city whose economic engine was building wooden merchant ships like the Andrew J. Fuller pictured here, which is downstairs in the library's reading room. And many similar ships were built just down the street from Douglas's house. To this, to a city that transformed itself into a wartime dynamo as Bath Iron Works churned out destroyers for world wars. Let's look at how Alice May addressed that holdover from the 19th century temperance. This is a WCTU pledge card. Taking the pledge, that is, promising to abstain from alcohol, was a well-known methodology of the WCTU. And Alice's first foray into public journalism was likely in an essay on temperance. She joined the WCTU's WISE in their youth group in her early 20s. Now, you may know that Maine led the nation in temperance and prohibition by passing legislation in 1851 known as the Maine Law, banning the manufacture and sale of liquor. But as Alice May came into her 20s, about 30 years after the Maine Law was passed, there is ample evidence that the law was often amended, overturned, returned, and ignored by law enforcement. People in Maine drank and often became inebriated and sometimes became alcohol dependent. And Bath, at least according to Alice May Douglas, was notable for its laxity. In 1888, at the age of 23, Douglas gives a small glimpse of what the city was like in a lengthy essay published by the Bath Independent. In its supplement of October 20th, 1888, there appears an article edited exclusively for the Independent by Miss Alice M. Douglas, with the intriguing title, Cider and Cigars. The paper had published a few of her poems previous, but in this piece, she speaks with a more mature and forceful voice about the effects of alcohol and tobacco on children. And I quote, "It has been said that a sawmill can no more be run without logs than a saloon without boys. There are myriad temptations even in this city. We know of cases where little boys have been urged to drink whiskey. Cigars are given to boys who will run errands for grocerymen. Boys do not begin by drinking strong drink, but by sipping the cider, which creates an appetite for something more dangerous." The Pacific Banner was a publication of the WCTU's Department of Peace and Arbitration. Alice May Douglas believed that alcohol abuse and violence were inextricably linked, and it was the WCTU's advocacy for peace that drew her in most strongly and gave her a national platform for her views. In 1889, just months after its initial issue, she published her first piece in the Pacific Banner. And you can see that it was published in Winthrop Center, Maine. More about that in a minute. Her first published piece was an anecdote about a baby named Peace who brings happiness to her parents. Just 3 years after that first piece was published, Alice May Douglas became associate editor and found a forum for her adult voice. For the next 12 years, Alice May wrote and edited for the Pacific Banner and its sister publication for children, The Acorn. The Pacific Banner covered international news in some detail, news from Europe and Asia about conflicts and the political progress or lack of progress of the international peace movement. But it also provided local stories about grassroots peace groups and suggested strategies for all ages to avoid personal conflict. And here is the banner of the Acorn. Alice May was deeply involved in the Acorn. She adored children, though she remained unmarried and childless. The Acorn featured stories, poems, and games for children with articles encouraging peaceful resolution of differences. Professor Tara McCarthy, in a paper entitled "The Humaner Instinct of Women," examines in depth the contributions to the peace movement by the Pacific Banner and the Acorn, and notes that Alice May Douglas did most of the work. Alice May was made associate editor of the Acorn in 1895 and was recognized as editor in 1898. Ironically, in that year, the Spanish-American War began. This is Hannah Johnston Bailey, another Maine woman, a Quaker, who was editor and publisher of the two papers, as well as serving as the superintendent of the WCTU Department of Peace and Arbitration. It is tantalizing to speculate about the relationship between these two remarkable women. How did their ideas affect each other? Hannah Bailey was 25 years Alice May's senior. She'd also been included in A Woman of the Century and was born the same year as Frances Willard. By the time Bailey was publishing The Banner and the Acorn, Hannah Bailey had been married, widowed, and in addition to the work on temperance, international peace efforts, and suffrage, she ran several successful businesses started by her late husband. Influential ideas of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, such as discouraging war toys for children, opposition to military drills for children, and the formation of peace bands, were espoused by both women, but most often were written about by Alice May, who later in her life claimed these as her original ideas. Hannah Bailey never fully acknowledged Douglas's contributions. The abuse of alcohol certainly didn't start with the Civil War, but the war produced, as all wars do, combatants who returned from home damaged and broken. Waiting for battles or troop movements in a war of great distances, soldiers played cards, gambled, and drank. Often the liquor was supplied by the Army. In an 1892 editorial in the Pacific Banner, the editor declared that there were 17,000 veteran inmates at Togus. 14,000 of them were said to be, quote, confirmed drunkards. As the 19th century moved into the 20th century, with no scientific methods of effectively confronting substance abuse, they didn't say substance abuse, that's the term I'm applying to it, many men and women saw prohibition as a means to solving the problem. In the late 1880s into the 1890s, there were many looks back at the war between the states and its aftermath in the Pacific Banner. Quaker John in the Civil War, a serialized novel by Alice May Douglas from 1891, delves into the moral and ethical dilemmas faced by a Quaker who volunteered to help during that horrific war. Both Alice May Douglas and Hannah Bailey came from Quaker backgrounds, and both had close relatives who did go to war as medics and even as combatants. It is likely the stories of their family members that informed Douglas's novel. The village where Quaker John, the title character, and his family live, was all but closed down as the war drained its workforce. The local mill and stores closed, their proprietors gone to engage in the trade of blood. Once Quaker John joins the Army as a medic, a long march ensues, and over time their provisions are exhausted and the famished men become weak. The solution of the officers was to offer alcohol as a stimulant. A soldier swilling hard cider, furnished by the Union Army, says, and I quote, "Whenever the conscience of any warned him of his danger, he would argue, 'Is not this liquor furnished by the United States government? Does not so wise a nation know what is best for her defenders? Surely our country owes a great duty to the drunkards made by war.'" And Alice paints women characters too. Aunt Matilda was a sharp-tongued but wise and well-respected woman of that same village at the heart of the novel. And she eventually decides she will join the war effort with the men. Her young Quaker friend Phoebe asks her, "What will you do on the battlefield?" And the reply, and I quote, is, "Nurse the poor soldiers, to be sure. When men are preparing to tear the heads and arms and legs off 2,000 or 3,000 persons, don't you think there is need of one sensible person to lend a hand when they are suffering so?" Anything that touched children were of special concern to Douglas. Growing up among the shipyards of Bath, she must have known that boys were often employed on sailing vessels, and she must also have known that boys had been allowed to serve in the Civil War. Johnny Clem, seen on the far right, was a famous Union drummer as he stands there with his bayonet. She must have known that boys, all boys, are particularly fond of playing at good guys and bad guys, making every stick a rifle, every stone a weapon. But after the war, during her writing career, boys were often encouraged to join military drills at school and even in Sunday school. They were often organized into a popular organization of the time, founded originally in Scotland, called Boys' Brigades, complete with uniforms, military parades with marching, and even the youngest participants might carry weapons. Alice May saw this as a perverse activity to convince citizens still recovering from the effects of the Civil War that wars were a path to glory. She wrote about this often. And I quote, "Our first and greatest work is to teach the children the reasonableness of peace and arbitration and to discourage them in them a love for military display. We accomplish this by organizing peace bands and by encouraging parents to keep from their children toy pistols and other military toys." The image here is of a boys' brigade with muskets and bayonets circa 1895 in Cornwall-on-Hudson, coincidentally, Hannah Bailey Johnston's hometown. Alice May Douglas's most famous hymn for the peace/mercy bands, "The Vacant Lots of Beulah," is from a collection of hymns for the peace bands by her. Whoops. There we go. And I just need to get out of this for a second. Nope. There we go. Hang on. This is by a member of my family.
Okay, I'm not going to play the whole thing because I can't play all 4 parts, but 2 and chorus.
let's see if I can get back into. There we go. In 1905, when she was 40 and The Banner and the Acorn had stopped publishing, Alice May Douglas gathered her thoughts and writings together and produced a paper, The Influence of the Military Drill Upon the Character of Young People. And it was accepted at the International Conference of Education and the Protection of Childhood in the Family, held in Liège, Belgium. Although the conference expected each paper to be given in French and read by the author, they made an exception to the rule for Alice May, who did not speak or write in French and did not travel to Liège, as far as we know. The paper was read by the Secretary of the Congress. I've been unable to find a copy of the paper that was read. The Bath Independent did write about the honor, albeit on the back page, but this is an excerpt from one of her Acorn articles about military drills for children in public schools. And I quote, "Many parents do not permit their children to use firearms. Is it proper for the public schools to place them in the hands of such pupils? If the military drill be introduced into the public schools for calisthenic purposes, some legitimate system of gymnastics would be far preferable and would offend no one. Military tactics teaching the art of killing, no matter in what light they are viewed, that is their primary object. At this enlightened century, the youth deserve training in some more elevated art." And one thing I forgot to say about her peace bands, there was definitely a peace band in Bath. There were peace bands all over the country, and we know there was a peace band in Australia, and sadly, in Palestine. Let's take a look at a photo of Bath at the very end of the 1800s. Can you get rid of the? Yeah, okay, okay, there we go. It was at that time, the late 1800s, that Alice May Douglas published one of her most notable pieces. It was not published in the WCTU papers, but in another publication, and it is about the city of Bath. In Alice's time, nearby houses on Washington and Front Streets overlooked a packed stretch of commercial wharves and shipyards. In 1890, there were 14 shipbuilding yards in Bath, and many were clustered at the north end of the city, just a few hundred steps from her door. After the Civil War, the utility of iron ships was recognized, and the old international trade routes were changing. Great wooden sailing ships were outmoded. After the war, the US and shipbuilding cities like Bath slid into a recession, and Bath was faced with an uncertain and unimaginable economic future. Building ships of iron and steel demanded a much larger initial and ongoing investment, and few in Bath had the resources or the skills to turn from wood to metal. As Douglas continued her career as an activist, writer, and editor espousing peace, the sounds of the hammers on wood down toward the Kennebec were slowly silenced, and instead, the ring of tools working on steel rang out. This bowsprit, intruding on Front Street, is part of a steel ship, one of the big steel square riggers built at the Sewell Yard from 1893 to 1903. The last decade of the 19th century in Bath was a transition from wood to steel, and also a transition from merchant marine enterprises to building ships of war. It was certainly a time of economic hardship and uncertainty. And Alice May Douglas was there to observe and report and to offer her opinion on that transformation. Brevet Brigadier General Thomas Worcester Hyde had commanded a brigade of 3,000 infantrymen in the Civil War and had parlayed his reputation and his old military connections to build steel ships for the military at Bath Iron Works, which in its early years also built commercial vessels and pleasure boats. In 1893, his Bath Iron Works was to build a technologically advanced ship for the Navy, the ram Katahdin. And almost everyone saw the Navy contract as an economic boon to the struggling city. It was an impressive steel armored vessel, over 2,000 tons displacement and over 250 feet long. At the time of Katahdin's launch, the American Navy was engaged in dealing with Hawaiian rebellions and was keeping a watchful eye on the Spanish maneuvers in the Caribbean that would eventually lead to the Spanish-American War. The Navy's scope and purpose had changed drastically since the end of the Civil War. America was now recognized as an international power, and the U.S. Navy needed rebuilding. The voices of pacifists in the WCTU, or essays about the immorality of war by Alice May Douglas in Bath, Maine, were but murmurs, but Douglas did not give up. The Portland Press Herald of February 6, 1893, reports enthusiastically that about 6,000 were present for the festive launch of the Katahdin. And after the strange-looking vessel slid down the ways, quote, a detachment of Bath businessmen marched 648 strong to Elmhurst, the residence of General T.W. Hyde, to celebrate further. And Elmhurst is what is now the high school. Hyde addressed the crowd and noted, the policy of our government has given us a chance and experience. He knew that being a trusted partner of the U.S. Navy would transform the city of Bath. Maine's Senator Hale was credited in the Portland Daily Press with the best speech of the evening. In it, he professed belief in great industrial establishments that will allow reestablishing the Navy, and it was all to start here in Bath. However, a month later, in the March 1893 edition of the journal American Advocate for Peace, Alice May Douglas published a report also chronicling the launch of the Katahdin. Douglas's article about the vessel's launch does not recreate the enthusiasm of the local press. She says, the ram is well named, for her only object is to run into enemy ships. And so powerful is she that she can cause destruction to the largest steel-clad vessels afloat. She is provided with a curious beak, which she will use in the same manner as the swordfish uses his sword, namely to plunge into the sides of vessels. Armored sides have done their fatal work. And then comes the final paragraph of her report. Apropos of today, the day was so cold that the band could not render music at the launch. Perhaps it was just as well that they could not. Gay music seemed scarcely the thing at the launch of a vessel whose purpose is to sink vessels, sending their crews to a watery grave and an endless eternity. As a 28-year-old woman, she concludes by disputing the generally accepted view so concisely stated by General George Washington that preparing for war produces peace, Alice says, "The ram is the only vessel of its kind ever constructed, and we sincerely hope it may be the last, for the best way to produce war is to prepare for it." In 1895, the Pacific Banner ceased publication. 6 years later, in 1901, the Acorn, with Alice May Douglas now as editor, was also shut down. Alice May was still a young woman then, barely in her 30s, much younger seeming than these two pictures. When I first began researching Alice May Douglas seriously in 2020, there were perhaps, I don't know, 6 or 7 of her publications other than the WCTU papers listed in Google Books. Had she finished her writing career without the WCTU to support her? Most of the pieces she wrote for other publications I found paid about 13 to 15 cents per article. Certainly not enough to make her wealthy, but certainly enough to contribute to the household. But no, the many publications and libraries and collections that contribute to Google Books have since the end of COVID been busy digitizing and dispersing works in their collections. And in 2024, there are now many pages of articles, poems, short stories, and essays collected from publications for which Alice wrote, and which I'm now delving into. She wrote often for children. Her poem, Who Knows the Trees Best, Who Loves the Trees Best, was included in countless readers for students. Alice May was involved in the Sunday school movement and often wrote not only about religious education, but also about pedagogy for young students generally. She became a leader in the Maine Humane Society and wrote articles for their publications. She publicized her support for World Peace Day events, which she often organized in Maine, and Arbor Day events too. She was a frequent speaker at events all over Maine for arbitration and other causes. And my very favorite, she obtained a Maine state hunting and fishing license when she was 43. I'm assuming she did not carry a rifle into the woods to hunt deer, but I certainly can imagine her fishing. When she was 40, the Encyclopedia Americana included Alice May Douglas in their volume of notable women, just as Woman of the Century had in 1893. But this time, the Bath Independent took at least some notice. The author of the article admits that being included in so prominent a volume, and I quote, would seem to indicate that her fame as an author has become national. However, she is identified not as a professional writer, editor, and activist, but as the daughter of the late J. Lufkin Douglas. Although a writer, I believe Bath has every reason to remember with pride, in her time, she could never quite rise above being a sweet girl from a good local family. But maybe that was as she wished. Acknowledgements from the local press were scarce. Both Alice May and her mentor, Hannah Bailey, recognized that their advocacy for peace made them seem unpatriotic while their nation was at war. How to approach substance use, international peace, the welfare of vulnerable children, all of these were highly controversial during her century and remain so today. After World War I broke out, the peace bands, for example, were renamed the Bands of Mercy. Alice May Douglas was no longer the daring young woman declaring her indignation about cider and cigars. And if she continued to write about her peaceful city producing great ships of war, we don't yet have any evidence. We know from the biographical works and from her obituaries when she died that Alice May was a social person. She belonged to many clubs and societies. She had many friends in the city of Bath and beyond. Perhaps she was content with letting her national reputation and fiery writings about pacifism cool and fade a bit. When she died in 1943, the Portland Press Herald ran her picture beside a detailed obituary, and that's the picture on the left, mentioning all her major written works. Some of those are also cited in her obituary from the Bath Independent, but their coverage was far more modest. But this paragraph stands out to me because it paints such a vivid picture of this woman. Miss Douglas was a tiny white-haired figure whom the children of a few years ago loved greatly, and she was active in organizing them into bands of mercy. She had a great collection of curios from all over the world and annually held exhibitions of them for the delight of school children. And this is Alice as a tiny tot, and her ubiquitous picture that appears on her Wikipedia page and many, Alice in her later years. And thanks to the Douglas McPhee Smith family for providing those. And in a second. The most important resources for the historians and those interested in the audience, the Pacific Banner and the Acorn, published in Winthrop Center, Maine by the World Women's Christian Temperance Union Department of Peace and Arbitration, exist because they were preserved by Hannah Bailey's family, who donated her papers to the Peace Collection of Swarthmore College, where they have been digitized and published through a site called In Her Own Right, RIGHT, A Century of Women's Activism, 1820 to 1920, Alice May Douglas's century. They can be read by anyone with access to the internet. Once I discovered the Pacific Banner and the Acorn, they kept me busy and fascinated throughout COVID lockdown. My deepest thanks to the Douglas family members who are here today. Betsy Douglas McPhee, who still lives in Bath, Alice was her great aunt. Tracy McPhee Smith, who has been ever gracious and willing to share the resources of the family and be my communicator back and forth. And Todd McPhee and her son, Eric, who is in the back row, and her brother, Todd McPhee, who is also an amateur historian and who did one of these town history gigs a few years ago on a Civil War rifle, which I watched the other day. You were really good. And he lives in Woolwich. And my thanks, so great thanks to the people, the staff of the Patent Free Library, starting with years ago, everybody at the library who has been so helpful and supportive. And I thank you for coming. And I hope that you have learned something about Alice. And if there are any questions, I would be happy to answer some.